Welcome to the Temple of the Silver Stars public webinar. My name is Matthew. I'm an academic track instructor in the Temple of the Silver Star, and this will be our last class in our 7-part series on astrological magic. So today we'll be doing a few different things, a couple of just sort of miscellaneous pieces, as well as some summary stuff, and then some conclusion or additional like context, kind of maybe coming full circle to some of the things that we did at the beginning, and just trying to wrap up a lot of the stuff we've been talking about. So yeah, we'll be doing a little bit of following up on some of the major themes that we've seen so far. Of course, we've been kind of jumping back and forth and also combining both astrology and magic and talking something about the relations of those things, as well as linking into Qabalah and different aspects of esoteric symbolism and the way that relates to both magic and to astrology and the way that helps to bridge between them. So we'll look at a little bit of I'm going to add one extra piece of astrology for you that I think is helpful, and we'll do a little bit of summary of astrology, and then a couple extra things about hexagram rituals, just sort of a few additional pieces and interesting things. And then we'll do a little wrap up for the series. So a little bit lighter, hopefully, than some of our other classes, and some interesting stuff too. I wanted some of the stuff to be kind of like a bonus for anyone who's stuck it out this long with the series. So let's just get right into it here. All right, so to ease us into this piece of astrology that we're going to see, I just want to talk in general about calendars and the ideas of time and the relation of calendars to astrology. The history of the human use of calendars is directly tied to planetary and astrological cycles, and of course the seasons of the year. These things are all tied to astrological motion, and so our relationship to time, even our experience of night and day, these have astrological meanings. And as we saw, the distinction between a day chart and a night chart is a really important one, especially from a more traditional perspective. So even things that are just very fundamental, things about the relationships of the human relationship to time, the day, the seasons, the lunar cycle, all of these things are linked in and connected to astrology, and I think speak in very profound ways to humanity and our relationship to time and our relationship to cycles too. That's a few things that's come up in the course of our series here, is the notion of cycles and our relationship to cycles, and so calendars is a nice way to get into this. So we'll just talk about 3 primary types of calendars. There are a few other sorts of calendars out there, but these are the 3 main types. So first we have solar calendars. So these are the ones we're most familiar with. The calendar that we use, the Gregorian calendar, is essentially a solar calendar, so that the equinoxes and solstices happen at approximately the same day every year, because the solar year, the time it takes the Earth, to make one complete circuit around the sun, that doesn't divide out exactly into an even number of days. That's why we have leap year and everything. So there's a little bit of variance there, but our calendar is fundamentally tied to the solar cycle. So that's a solar calendar. We also have lunar calendars. These are calendars connected to the moon. Now, they aren't entirely independent of solar calendars, because most lunar calendars use 12 lunar months, and obviously that 12 there has to do with the 12 full moons, the 12 that happen in the course of every solar year. So there's at least some relationship between a lunar calendar and a solar calendar. But because the 12 lunar months works out to be, I think about 255 days. So it's 10 days off from the solar calendar. So in cultures that use purely lunar calendars, like the Arab, the Islamic sacred calendar is an entirely lunar calendar. So that calendar is 12 lunar months, based on 12 lunations. And so that calendar is only 255 days, which means that each month in the Islamic calendar begins, from the point of view of a solar calendar, begins 10 days earlier each year, because that calendar, the 12 months, only add up to 255 days. Right, so that calendar precesses. It's not tied to the solar cycle. And then you also have hybrid calendars, which we generally call lunisolar calendars. And an example of this would be like the Chinese calendar. So it's essentially a lunar calendar. You know, the moon's phases are determining the months, right? The months, you know, begin and end with the new moon. But the calendar is never allowed to drift too far from the solar cycle. So what you end up doing is adding a 13th month approximately every 3 years, so that although like the day of the Chinese New Year, for example, it's not on the same day relative to the equinoxes and solstices, but it can never drift that far from it, because once it starts to get close to being a month out, then you add an extra month into the calendar, and then that resets it again. So that's kind of a hybrid calendar between the lunar and the solar. All right, so this gets us into talking about just measurements of time and the connection to astrological cycles. So the year, of course, the solar year, which is also, you know, the cycle of the seasons, right? And our motion around the sun and our angle relative to the ecliptic. This is what produces the seasons. So the Earth, you know, orbits the sun in about 365.24 days. And so we use a 365-day calendar in the Gregorian calendar, and then every 4 years, that leap year, we add in an extra day to keep it synced up to the solar cycle. Except for every 100 years, then you don't do a leap year, because the Julian calendar, which just did a leap year every 4 years, that starts to get ahead, and so you occasionally have to not do a leap year to keep it in sync with the solar cycle. Right, so our idea of the year, that's based on our relationship to our yearly cyclic relationship to the sun. And the concept of the month is based on the lunar phase cycle. And we'll be talking more about the lunar phase cycle in just a few minutes on our next slide here. And so that's about 29.5 days. So our idea of the month, now our months aren't tied to the lunar cycle any longer, but that idea of the month is fundamentally based on the moon, and even the word month is related back to the German word meaning moon. Now, also, we've talked about weeks already in the 7 days of the week. When we talked about planetary days and hours back in our, what was that, third class or second class, whatever that was. Right, so we already talked about that 7-day cycle being connected to the 7 planets, but we can also realize that the 7 days is also an approximate quartering of the Synodic month, right? So that if you divide the moon's cycle of 29.5 days, you divide that by 4, you divide it into quarters, you get 7 point some number of days. So there's a kind of approximation to the quarters of the month here with the week. And then, again, as we talked about, the 7 days of the week correspond to the 7 planets. Now, also the individual days. Now, this is our axial rotation relative to the sun. So the Earth, makes one rotation relative to the position of the sun. There's also something called sidereal days, which are slightly shorter than our days, and that's one axial rotation relative to the background of the fixed stars. And if you use like an ephemeris, you'll encounter that idea of sidereal days. That's just measuring our rotation around our axis relative to the stars rather than relative to the sun, which is slightly different, because our position relative to the sun is constantly changing over the course of the year. All right, and then finally, the shorter division of time here that we're going to talk about is hours, and this is based on the ancient way of dividing the day and night into 12 equal parts, which again we saw when talking about planetary days and hours. The day is divided into 12 equal. The time between sunrise and sunset is divided into 12 equal sections, and the time from sunset to sunrise is also divided into 12 equal sections. And then we have an image of Thoth there on the left. Thoth, of course, is the Egyptian god of magic and writing and knowledge and scribes, but he's also the creator of the calendar. And it's likely that this is linked to, Thoth is connected to the moon in the traditional Egyptian religion. Later on, he also gets linked to Mercury through his equation to the Greek Hermes and the Roman Mercury, but classically associated with the moon. And part of this may be that because the first calendars were lunar calendars, those associated with the moon has to do with his status as the creator of the calendar. Yeah, the history of calendars is a really interesting thing. We're not going to spend much time with it here, but it's a really interesting thing to look into. Yeah, I find it very interesting. And also, the sacred nature of calendars is very important here too. While, there were like civil calendars and things like that as well. And the other days of the week, the other sort of week lengths besides 7 days that were often based on like market, where like the markets took place in different cities and things like that. A lot of the calendars, especially ones that remain fixed and constant over long periods of time, were related to sacred calendars of timing, when certain holidays were celebrated, and when certain rites and things like that were to be practiced. And this was certainly true of Egypt. You actually had a special class of priests who just monitored what time it was, especially at night, based on which stars were rising over the ascendant, and then using that as to know what time certain rites were to be performed. And then that way of thinking, of course, then goes on to influence astrological magic and electional astrology, and all this based on the idea that there are certain times that are better fitted for certain actions than others. So all this stuff is tied together, all this magic and astrology and our experience of time, and our experience of the sacred cycles, and the idea that certain times have particular qualities. All these things are linked together. Yeah. So again, there's a lot more there, but we'll just move on. All right, so the last real piece of astrology that I want to introduce in this series is what we'll call synodic cycles or solar phase cycles. These are just two different names for the same thing. And what this is each planet's cyclical relationship to the sun. So of course, the sun, as we've been talking about, is not like the other planets. Of course, it's just comprises almost all of the mass in the solar system, and it's also the source of all light in the solar system, and so it makes sense that each planet would have a special relationship to the sun from our point of view, and as we'll see, this is related to light and to how much light is reflected by that planet from the sun. Of course, the light of all, when you look up and see the planets, of course this is obvious about the moon, but it's true of all the other planets as well. If you see Jupiter in the night sky, the fact that you can see Jupiter is because Jupiter is reflecting sunlight back to your eye, right? All that those sources of light are all essentially reflected solar light. All right, so here's a chart that you've seen before. Earlier in the class series. So we've got our 7 planets and called in order there. And then we have the orbital periods of the planets and how often the planets change signs, which we've already talked about and you should be fairly familiar with, I imagine. But we're also going to talk about the synodic periods and the retrograde periods. So I'll say that we'll back up a little bit. So in the cyclic relationship to the sun, the two most dramatic things that happen is a time when a planet goes retrograde, which happens at a certain point within the planet's solar phase cycle, and then also when the planet conjoins the sun. So that's some of the key things that we're going to be looking at, and some of the main things too that we're going to be looking at. There's other things that you can do with the solar phase cycles, like you can look at whether a planet is like rising in the east before in the morning and the planet is a morning star, or whether it's setting after the sun in the west in the evening and is an evening star. How bright the planet is, all of these sorts of things as well. But we're mainly going to focus on the two most dramatic things that happen in the solar cycle, which is the retrogradation and then the conjunction with the sun. All right, so obviously the sun itself has no synodic cycle and never goes retrograde because we're talking about the relationship to the sun. So we're talking about the other 6 planets. Now the moon has a synodic period, right? This is the 29.5 days of the lunar month. This is the moon's cycle of waxing and waning. But the moon never goes retrograde, right? The moon orbits the Earth, and so there's no retrogradation. So the moon has the simplest of the synodic cycles, and also the most obvious one. I mean, you really notice the waxing and waning of the moon. That's extremely obvious, and so the moon in some ways can become kind of the moon cycle can become in some ways like the archetypal synodic cycle, at least for that that waxing and waning, because it happens so much more obviously with the moon than with the other planets. Though of course it does happen with the other planets. Mars is brighter when Mars is opposite to the sun. That's like the sort of full Mars, but it's just not as noticeable and not as dramatic as with the moon. And then with the other 5 planets, as well as the other the planets beyond Saturn as well, this is also true of Uranus and Neptune and Pluto and all that, but we're just focusing on the 7 classical planets here. So the other 5, they also have periods when they are retrograde. Now the planets don't actually move backwards, but they appear to move backwards from our point of view because of our motion, the Earth's motion relative to their motion. They appear to move backwards in the zodiac. So Mercury has a synodic period of 116 days. So we're measuring from, usually you start with now Mercury and Venus have the most complex synodic cycles. So you're starting with one of their solar conjunctions and then measuring up until the next one. So Mercury's cycle is 116 days long. So every 116 days, Mercury will go retrograde once, and he'll be retrograde for 3 weeks. Now Venus and Mars have the longest synodic cycles. Venus has a synodic cycle that's a little bit longer than a year and a half, and Mars is a little bit longer than 2 years. And the reason theirs are so long is because their orbits are the closest in length to the Earth's orbit. So it takes a very long time, for 2 cycles that are very close to each other but only a little bit off. It takes a very long time for those cycles to go back to being back to the places where they started again. So about every year and a half, Venus goes retrograde, and she's retrograde for about 6 weeks. Now Mars only goes retrograde again about every 2.14 years, and he's retrograde for let's see, what is that? About 3 months, about is that like a little more than 2 months? So Mars is retrograde for about 72 days, but it's less often. As we talked about earlier, Mars also has the most kind of erratic of the synodic cycles. The other planets are much more regular than Mars is. I mean, it's perfectly predictable and everything, but it doesn't follow as neat and clean of a pattern as the others, which fits well with Mars's significations. And then Jupiter and Saturn have very simple and regular retrograde cycles. Or synodic, cycles. Their synodic period is just a little bit more than a year, because basically what's happening, because they're so much slower than the Earth, from our point of view anyways, what's happening is that the sun is just sort of it's like lapping Jupiter and Saturn. The sun is going all the way around the zodiac and then coming back to Jupiter and Saturn, who have only moved a little bit in the course of that year. Saturn's moved about 1/3 of a sign and Jupiter's moved about 1 sign. So the sun has to go just a little bit more than all the way around to come back to Jupiter and Saturn. And so Jupiter and Saturn, they go retrograde once every synodic cycle, which is about once every year, and they stay retrograde for about 4 months. All right, so we're going to take a look at the moon's cycle, and then we'll talk about the conjunctions with the sun, and then we'll talk about retrogrades. All right, so this is the lunar phase cycle. So the diagram you see on the left here, now don't get confused, this isn't a diagram representing, this isn't the moon's course around the zodiac. This is the moon's motion relative to the sun. So we're starting the cycle off here with the new moon. This is when the sun and moon are conjoined, right? They'll be at the same degree of the zodiac at the same time. That's the new moon, and obviously that's all of the light that the moon is reflecting. None of it is reaching us, right? Because the moon is between us and the sun. So we don't get any reflected light from the moon, and so the moon is dark from our point of view. So that's the new moon. And then now the moon moves about approximately 13 degrees every day, and the sun moves approximately 1 degree every day. And so what this means is that the moon will move away from the sun by about 12 degrees per day, approximately. Her speed varies a little because of the ellipticity of her orbit, but approximately 12. She moves away from the sun 12 degrees every day. Right, so we'll start off with the new moon, and then we enter the waxing. Then she begins waxing. So this will be the waxing quarter, right? She's less than half full, but increasing in light. Then we hit the first quarter, so now she's half full, and we're a quarter of the way through the cycle. She's still waxing and continues waxing up until we get the full moon. The full moon happens when the moon is opposite to the sun, and so when this happens, all of the light that the moon, or nearly all of the light that the moon is reflecting, is reaching us, and so the moon appears to be full and very bright in the sky from our point of view. And then as she continues to move around, she's now coming back towards the sun, right? At the opposition, she's the furthest away from the sun, from our point of view, that she can be. And so now she's coming back towards the sun, and so now she begins to wane. And then 3/4 of the way through the cycle, she hits the last quarter, so she's now half full and waning. And now she begins the waning crescent, and then comes back again to the new moon. And so that whole cycle takes about approximately 29.3 days. So when we see how this naturally divides into quarters, and so some meanings and significations get layered on top of this. One of the easiest and simplest ways of thinking about of talking about these significations is in terms of temperament. So we talked earlier throughout the series about the temperaments of the different planets, and we said that the moon was phlegmatic, right? The moon is cold and wet. That's the moon's inherent temperament. But as she goes through her phase cycle, this varies somewhat, but it's just important to remember that she's always starting from being cold and wet, and then that varies somewhat. So she'll never get extremely hot and extremely dry, but she can become somewhat drier and somewhat warmer, and then sometimes she's very cold and very moist. So let's see. So we see how this breaks down with her cycle. So while she's waxing, right? So this would be like the first 2/4 of her cycle. Then she's warmer. She's hot here, and then while she's waning, she's colder. And then we also see that while she's less than half full, she's moist, and then when she's more than half full, she's dry. So we have division into waxing and waning, and then division into being more or less than half full. And so this gives us 4 unique quarters. So the first quarter of her cycle is sanguine. It's hot and moist. Then the second quarter, so this is between the new moon up to the waxing half moon. This is the sanguine part of her cycle. So she's still quite moist, but it is somewhat warmed up. Then as she becomes more than half full, approaching full, then she's hot and dry. And so at this point, she'll be the closest to being, so she's hotter and drier here during this part of her cycle. And then as she goes past full, now she starts to cool down. She remains dry, but starts to cool down. And then as finally she passes the last quarter, she remains cold, but begins to become more moist. And part of this is based on just observation of nature, right? So that she begins cold and moist, and then as she's waxing, as she's gaining in light, she's also gaining in heat. And so if you take something that's cold and wet and you heat it up, right, some of that moisture will start to evaporate off. So as she heats, that she also then begins to dry, but the drying is like kind of staggered from the heating, right? So then as she gets past her first quarter, she's still hot. She's still in the heating part of her phase, but she's now dried out. That heat has dried her up a bit. And then as the heating part of her phase ends and she begins to cool down, at first she's still dry and is now becoming cooler. And then after a while, after she's been cooling for a while, now she starts to become moist again. Just like if you cool something down, you get condensation. And you can think about daily, the condensation that happens overnight, followed by and then the next morning after sunrise, once the sun sun starts shining, on that dew and everything, that starts to evaporate and things start to dry out. So you can think about these kind of daily cycles of heating and drying and condensation and evaporation as well. So this is part of it, and again, as we talked about with the moon being connected to the body, especially if the moon is an important planet in your chart, like if you were born during the night, or if you have Cancer rising or important planets in Cancer or anything like that, and you're connected to the moon, we can look at the way that the moon's temperament affects your temperament, and the way that talks about health issue things and things like that. The way that your own preferences. You might even think about the way your temperament, the way that the moon's temperament in your chart relates to your own preferences around what climates feel good and all that. Your preferences for whether you prefer drier climates or more humid climates, or whether you're more comfortable in the heat or in a cooler environment. All these types of things can be connected to the moon's temperament in a birth chart. Okay, so in addition to the temperamental stuff, we can also develop some significations related to this, this symbolic cycle of growth and decay, or these kind of natural cycles, of a seed being planted and then emerging from the ground and then bearing fruit, and then that fruit, containing the seed of the next cycle. So you can draw a lot of metaphors again from natural cycles here. And as we've already talked about, the moon is very much connected to those natural cycles of growth and decay, of generation and corruption. If you remember back to our second class, we talked about that in association with the moon. And so in addition to that just being the general significations of the moon, we can also look at what particular phase she's in, in a birth chart, or at the current moment, or any time we're looking at charts or in transits and things like that. We can think about what phase of that cycle she's currently in. So over on the right there, I've got a chart just laying out some of this really basic stuff. And so the way I've broken it up into two halves, so that this is the waxing part of her phase here. So I've got general significations of waxing, and then some specific things for the waxing crescent period. That's the first quarter of her cycle, followed by the waxing gibbous. That's the second quarter of her cycle. Then we have the waning half here. So then we go to the waning gibbous to waning crescent, and then that takes us back to the beginning of the cycle here. So in general, what we can say about the waxing moon, and again, we already went through some of this in the second class, so some of this is just a reminder of that. While she's waxing, she's filling with light, right? So we have an accumulation of light, an accumulation of energy, and things like growth, generation, increase, right? In terms of natural cycles, this is the springtime when things are growing, things are budding, things are that seed is unpacking and unfolding itself into the complete plant that it's becoming. So this is the growth part of the phase. So in the waxing crescent, this is the sanguine part of the cycle here, the first quarter of her cycle. This is sprouting, birth, and light emerging from darkness and beginning. Right, this is the beginning of the cycle, the beginning of something emerging out of the, a plant emerging out of the earth, or light emerging out of darkness, right? And you think of when in the few days, after the new moon, after the dark moon, when the moon first becomes visible, it's just that thin crescent that then slowly grows, over the course of the month. Then in the second quarter of her cycle, as she's approaching full, this is the waxing gibbous phase. We could talk about significations of bright, powerful, vital, budding and blooming, and sort of swelling to fullness. So this is probably the most dynamic, part of this accumulation phase, when she's most really filling with vital energy and power. All right, and then the next two phases will be her waning. The next two quarters will both be part of the waning half of her cycle. So in general, we can say about waning that this is the part where she's pouring out all that light that she's accumulated. Right, the full moon is when she's completely full of light, completely full of energy, and is now pouring that out. So giving out that light, or returning to its source, or beginning the process of returning to the source there. So yeah, pouring out light, expenditure, decrease. And then in general, we could say about the moon, the waning moon, where the waxing moon is about like building up. The waning moon can be about conclusion or about dissolution. So in the waning gibbous part of her phase here, we're talking about bearing fruit, about harvest, about results, and also, the beginning of the phases of decomposition. This is now something past. It's the peak of its growth, right? And so this is the beginning of the stages of corruption. All right, and then finally in her last quarter, in the waning crescent, the seed is sort of entrusted to the darkness, right? That whatever it is that's been produced over the course of that cycle, that thing that seed is planted in the earth. To remain fallow for a bit, but then that thing will become the beginning of the next cycle. And we can also think about the moon being kind of reabsorbed into the sun here. And this is something we'll talk about with all the planets and their solar conjunctions that we could think about, again, because the idea of the sun is like the source of all light. The sun is like the source of all light, and the other planets' light as reflected from the sun, that the return to the sun, the coming back to the solar conjunction, is like the returning the light to the source. And so the planet becomes dark because all that light that they had been giving out has returned to the source, which is the sun. All right. So yeah, again, there's so much more we could say here, and there's a lot of really interesting, authors who have talked about this. The modern astrologer Dane Rudyard did a lot of work about the lunar phase and significations, and some of these ideas about making an analogy to like a growing plant and those sort of natural cycles. I was drawing from some of his work, and lots of others have talked about this as well. But it's just a really nice thing to keep track of, a nice thing to look at. When you're looking at birth charts, like what part of the cycle are you in, in your natal chart, and then also just looking at this as a monthly cycle, in the way that this flows in your own life or in the lives of people around you or in other kind of mundane cycles. It's a great thing just to keep track of and just to pay attention to and watch and see what happens. All right, so now let's talk about the solar conjunctions. So again, this is in each planet's phase relationship to the sun. The planet starts. We generally talk about the cycle starting with the conjunction with the sun, and then separating from the sun, and then coming around and coming back to the sun again. So this is one way we can think about this anyways, is that the planets are almost kind of like born out of the sun, right? The sun is like the father or the source of the other planets and the source of all that light and energy. And so they separate away from the sun and become their own. They have their own sort of individual existence and go through their cycle. And then at the end of it, they return to the sun and are like renewed again. There's a kind of phoenix-like sort of imagery here of something that's like born out of fire and then lives and then is finally consumed by that fire again, which is also the beginning of the next phase of the cycle. So while a planet is very close to the sun, what happens in just astronomical terms, in terms of just observation, the planet can't be seen if a planet is too close to the sun. So if a planet is within about 15 degrees of the sun, that planet will not be visible at any time during the day. If a planet's more than 15 degrees away from the sun, approximately, the actual observational conditions and stuff vary, but 15 degrees is a good approximation, and that's what's generally used for astrological purposes. If a planet's more than 15 degrees away from the sun, you'll be able to see it at some point, either in the morning, in the east before the sun rises, or after sunset, or if a planet is like at its opposition to the sun, the planet will just be like high and bright in the sky all night long. But if a planet is within 15 degrees of the sun, there'll never be a time when that planet is visible. By the time that planet either like rises over the eastern horizon, the sky has already gotten so light that the planet won't be seen. Or if it's west of the sun, after sunset, by the time that planet, the sky won't have gotten dark enough by the time that planet sets, and so the planet is just not visible. So again, this is like the planet has been taken back into that fiery source. And so this is an important source of meaning for delineating charts. And so whenever you're looking at a chart, you just want to pay attention to if there's any planet within 15 degrees of the sun, that'll affect the way that planet expresses itself. So we have several different stages of intensity of this condition, depending on how far the planet is away from the sun. So if the planet's between 15 degrees and 8 degrees, now that 8 degrees varies a little bit. You'll see some sources giving slightly different numbers, but generally about 8 degrees, and that's generally the standard. So if the planet's like more than 8 degrees away from the sun, but less than 15 degrees on either side of the sun, then we say that the planet is under the beams. And so the planet is hidden, it's invisible, but it's not extremely close to the sun. And so we see significations of things like invisibility, or also like internalization. Again, with that, the planet being like taken back into its source. That planet is kind of in like a natal chart. We can talk about that planet manifesting internally, like rather than externally, or there being the quality or the nature of that planet not being visible, but about it being like internal. So it's not that it won't like affect the chart or something like that. It's just that we would tend to see it more on like an inner or a more private level than for something more obvious. There's I forget who it is now, but there's a Hellenistic text that talks about if like the ruler of the 7th house, the house of marriage, if the ruler of that house is under the beams, then you get this the signification of invisibility linked to marriage, and they say that person will have a secret marriage. They'll get married in secret, right? So just really simply combining that signification of invisibility because the planet is invisible. All right, and then as we get a little bit closer, if the planet is within 8 degrees of the sun, but not extremely close, so like more than a degree away, but less than 8 degrees away on either side of the sun, this is a more extreme condition here called combustion, or that we said that the planet is combust. And so at this point, the planet is really now being like really taken back into the heat of the sun. We can think of the planet, it's almost like having your car in the shop or something like that. The planet is being purified by that solar fire, or has just been purified by that solar fire, but is hasn't separated away enough, and so is still in the process of its purification. And so this is generally considered like a debility for that planet. And again, I mean, this isn't like an extreme thing. It's like like with a planet being in the sign of its detriment or something like that. It's not exactly. I mean, we always want to like nuance these things. It's not exactly the same as being in the sign of its detriment, but we could think along the same lines that planet's just going to struggle to be able to fulfill its normal significations, because it's right in the middle of this process of being like reabsorbed into the sun, only to be born again. When it's right in the middle of that process, it's not particularly functional, and it's also really blended into the sun. So there could also be kind of like the idea of like a loss of independence, where again, the sun in a lot of traditional texts is like linked to the king or to the monarch or to the ruler. The idea of being like too closely connected or too visible to the monarch would not allow you to act independently, right? Like you're constantly under the scrutiny or the gaze of the ruler, and so there's like a loss of independence. The king is always like looking over your shoulder as you're doing things. So that's a difficult condition. Generally speaking, but it's just one among several. That's just one factor that you would take into consideration, when delineating a planet in a chart. But then when the planet is extremely close to its actual conjunction, we have a condition that's called Kazimi. Now, different authors disagree a little bit about what exactly the degree range is for Kazimi. In some of the older material, it's a degree. So the planet is conjunct with the sun within 1 degree. And then in the medieval period, this range tends to get narrowed somewhat. And the smallest range, at least that I've ever encountered, is 17 minutes. Each degree is divided into 60 minutes. So 17 minutes is just a little bit more than a quarter of a degree. So that would be the most extreme range, would be just like that quarter of a degree. And then the most generous is up to a whole degree away. I've approximated here to like about half a degree on either side. And it's probably one of those things that there's no absolute like hard and fast line. As you get like within a degree of the sun, you might start to see some of this emerging, but then it won't become really pronounced until you get like almost very, very close to that exact solar conjunction. All right, and so this condition is called Kazimi. This word Kazimi is derived from an Arabic word, which means in the heart. So that being Kazimi is like being in the heart of the sun. And so the significations here with a planet that is extremely close to the sun is that combustion is mitigated, that the planet is so closely like blended with the sun that the solar power sort of amplifies the planet in some ways, as if the planet and the sun have like really united themselves together. So this mitigates the combustion, right? This is no longer a debility if it's this close. And again, there's some disagreement about exactly how good it is, but it's generally considered to add power and favorability. So being Kazimi is generally seen as a favorable thing. So just some stuff to be aware of here with each planet's conjunction with the sun. Now, and one thing that's important to know here is that there's a condition called where a planet is said to be in their chariot if they are in their own domicile or in their exaltation, and this frees them from being debilitated by combustion. So if you have say you have like Mercury and the sun in Gemini, right, which is one of Mercury's domiciles, and Mercury's combust. Say Mercury is within 6 degrees of the sun. Normally, having Mercury within 6 degrees of the sun would indicate some like difficulty with Mercury-related things, right? Or in whatever houses Mercury rules, those houses, there would be some difficulty with those houses. But because Mercury is in his own domicile, this mitigates the problems of combustion. You still might see some of the general significations of like internalization and invisibility and all that sort of stuff, but it doesn't hamper Mercury's functioning. And again, the images of a planet being like in their chariot, and especially like a covered chariot, right, as if they have some shade. So they're kind of shaded or shielded from the debilitating effects of the sun by virtue of being in a sign that they rule or a sign that they are exalted in. And then finally, because we've talked about this idea of like internalization or loss of independence and everything, the idea that these planets are that are within 15 degrees of the sun are kind of blending their significations in together with the sun. It's just important to note that just co-presence is enough to blend solar significations with other planets. So if you had a planet at like 1 degree of a sign, and then the sun was at like 29 degrees of the same sign, there would be relationship, there would be co-presence, right? The solar significations and the significations of that planet, would be blended together and connected. But they're 28 degrees apart, and so there's none of these conditions that we're seeing here would apply. All right, let's keep moving on here. All right, so now we get to the to retrogradation. So. So retrogradation, again, as we talked about, is the apparent backwards motion of a planet through the zodiac, which is really just our motion, relative to that planet, producing, that effect from our point of view. And again, we see the information we've already seen here about the synodic periods of each planet and how long they're retrograde. One important thing to really be aware of here is that with Jupiter and Saturn, and then even more so if you're using any of the planets beyond Saturn, their retrogradations are really not that dramatic. There's a kind of like like rhythm to it or something like that, that, after the solar conjunction, Jupiter will be like direct for 4 months, and then retrograde for 4 months, and then direct for about another 4 months before meeting back up with the sun again. So it's just there's a kind of, I've heard people use the analogy of like a tide, sort of flowing in and out. So there's certainly, like, it's not insignificant, but it's just not as dramatic as we see with Mercury, Venus, and Mars, where their retrograde cycles tend to be more pronounced and more dramatic, rather than just being part of this very like regular sort of shifting back and forth. All right, so retrogradation. Now, this is a well-known concept, and especially around the idea of Mercury retrogrades. I think sometimes over-exaggerate the importance of retrogradation. Again, it's like with a planet being in its detriment or a planet being combust with the sun. It's just one of a number of different factors that you're considering. There's no single factor that either like makes or breaks a planet's like condition, right? So it's just one thing to take into account. And I see people really kind of freaking out around every Mercury retrograde. It's important to remember that all of those planetary cycles are related to your own chart. So any given, like Mercury goes retrograde 3 or sometimes even 4 times in a year. But how important that is for any individual person is really going to matter. Is really going to depend on how important Mercury is in your own natal chart, as well as different like timing techniques that can show whether or not Mercury is like activated for you during that year. So that this is an important thing to be aware of, that you want to like filter that through other things. Not every Mercury retrograde is the end of the world. And we also see, especially in some coming from like a more traditional perspective, a broader range of meanings that retrogradation can happen. It's not simply that like everything, all the significations of that planet simply like don't work or are all broken. Sometimes you get more like symbolic things about backwardsness or about like retreading old ground or about returning to something from the past that isn't just about it like not working, right? So some things that retrogradation can signify includes like a reversal of the planet's usual significations. And this is where some of the problematic aspects of retrogradation can certainly manifest. Where Mercury signifies communication. Mercury retrograde can have like disruptions of communication or breaks in communication and things like that, right? So you can certainly get some of the more problematic things here with that like reversal of signification. Sometimes we also just see delays. And so this is especially like with Jupiter or something like that. Like if Jupiter is generally like well placed in a chart and is generally in good condition, but is retrograde, the retrograde probably isn't that significant. But you could see delays. It could be that like Jupiter, all those good, positive, helpful things that Jupiter brings, they just show up a little bit later. That's something that can certainly be seen with retrogrades. Sometimes also things about like questioning or rethinking, especially if there's something that you're like a project or something like that you're working on, or you in particular are like connected to a particular planet's cycle. There can be a kind of sense of like rethinking something that you're working on. Like rather than making forward progress, you're sort of like looking back at what you've been doing and thinking about it and reconsidering what's come in the past, which is related to the general themes of the past or a return of things from the past. It's never happened to me, but I've heard a number of stories about people during Venus retrograde periods, like an ex or an old lover or something like that who they hadn't had contact with in years maybe, suddenly shows back up in that person's life. I've heard that story a bunch of times. That's a fairly common thing for people to experience with Venus retrogrades, right? Because Venus signifies relationships, and because retrograde can talk about the past and a return of things from the past, an old relationship shows back up in your life during a retrograde period. And then that could be, for good or for ill, right? This doesn't have to be like a bad thing. Sometimes things coming back from the past can be really nice. So those are kind of the general significations that we can get out of the retrograde. Also, another thing to note here is that again, we don't have time to sort of really fully go through all of this, but in the course of each planet's cycle, as it has its direct motion, as it's approaching its retrograde, the planet will slow down, and then right at the transition from direct motion to retrograde motion, the planet will be essentially stationary briefly. And so this is, we say that the planet is stationing retrograde if it's like stationary in the process of going from direct to retrograde, or we can say the planet stations direct when the planet had been retrograde and has now come to its momentary standstill before going back to direct motion again. So when this happens, when a planet stations, when it makes this like pause while changing from direct to retrograde or retrograde to direct, the planets are said to speak. The Greek word here is phasis. So the planets speak, they like announce themselves. And so we can think of this being like an intensification of that planet's significations. And so this is something to look for like in transits and in mundane events too, when a planet is just stationing retrograde or just stationing direct. Sometimes there'll be things very directly related to that planet, can sort of show up in your life or in the news and things like that. Or if you're born, if you're in a natal chart, if you're born right around the time, usually like within a week is the range given, within a week of a planet like stationing direct or stationing retrograde, that planet is said to be kind of extra loud in your chart and extra prominent. And now this also happens when a planet emerges from, or at least a similar thing happens when a planet emerges from being under the beams. So if a planet had been hidden within the sun, as it rises out from being under the beams and becomes visible again, we get this same like temporary intensification of the planet as it suddenly appears, right? This is a kind of like dramatic action that the planet takes. And so that, that also adds, kind of turns up the volume on that planet. All right, so now there's a lot of other stuff that we could go into with synodic cycles, again, like making a distinction between whether a planet is like a morning star or an evening star and all sorts of other things. But the retrogradation period and the solar conjunction are the two most dramatic parts of the solar phase cycle. So I just wanted to introduce you to some of the, just some of the more dramatic things and just get you started thinking about this topic. And, again, connected to the calendars and things like that too, I think there's also something really profound here about the idea that you have all these different overlapping cycles, that you have the orbital cycles, the synodic cycles, all overlapping with each other in different ways. And one way of thinking about like what a natal chart is or any particular horoscope is, it's like a snapshot of a whole bunch of cycles that are overlapping in different ways, but are sort of frozen. And so I think that's a nice way to think about it, that these things are always things that are in motion, and they're always part of larger cycles. So when looking at your own birth chart, I think it's just nice to think like that there's all these cycles going on, and I was born, at a particular moment within all of these different cycles, and that's helpful both for practical purposes, but I also think there's something, something like profound that's worth contemplating about that idea about a birth chart being a kind of snapshot or a slice of a number of overlapping cycles. All right, so let's just do a little bit of summary here of some of the astrology that we've been talking about in this course series here. So, we've talked about a number of different things that affect a planet's condition all the way along. So just summarizing this, again, this is no way exhaustive. There's lots of other things that can also affect planet's condition. And each one of these things, I haven't gone into every single little detail that you'd want to look at, but in broad strokes anyways, this is a suggested outline, for how you could go about assessing the condition of a given planet in a given chart. All right, so first, we always want to ask about the sect and about the day and night, right? So we ask, is the planet of the sect of the chart or contrary to it, right? If you remember, the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn are of the day, and then the Moon, Venus, and Mars are of the night. So if this is a day chart, right? The Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn will match the sect. They'll be of the sect in favor, whereas the other three planets, the three night planets, will be contrary to the sect. So that's just a really basic distinction, and we talked about what that means and everything in some of our previous classes there. But just don't forget it. Whenever you're looking at a chart, you just want to be aware of whether it's a day chart or a night chart. And which planets are the day planets and which planets are the night planets. especially when looking at Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Those planets are significantly more favorable when they match the sect and are less favorable when they're contrary to the sect. All right, next we can ask, what sign is the planet placed in? The first thing we want to think about, is the planet's domicile? Does the planet rule that sign? Is the planet exalted in that sign? Does the planet have its fall in that sign or its detriment in that sign? Right, because those are important conditions to be aware of, and we talked about what that means in some of our previous classes. We also talked about the idea of last month, we talked about the idea of reception. So that's a nice thing just to remember to check for. If a planet is not in a sign that they rule, if they're in a sign ruled by another planet, what's the relationship of the planet in question to the planet that rules the sign that it's in, right? So if you find Venus in Capricorn, you'd want to look at what aspect, if any, Venus is making to Saturn, because Saturn is the ruler of Capricorn. And if they have a positive aspect like a trine, or whatever, that will be more favorable for Venus in that sign. Whereas if it's a more difficult aspect or there's no aspect, that'll be a little bit less favorable. So that's just an important part of delineating any planet in a sign. And then we can also ask what the condition of the ruler. Again, as we talked about a little bit before, if Venus is in Capricorn, how that works out for Venus will be in part influenced by how whether Saturn is in a strong or a favorable place. That will influence any planet within Capricorn or Aquarius. So we can just ask, what's the condition of the ruler? Which is interesting. You see how kind of layered this gets. In order to delineate the condition of a single planet, you also have to often look at the condition of the ruler of a planet. But to fully delineate the condition of that ruler, sometimes you have to look at other planets too. And so you start to get these like chains and networks of planets being ruled by each other and relying on other planets. And then sort of following out those links really starts to show you that the kind of dynamics of the chart and the way that different aspects of the person's life are connected together. Or how one thing is dependent on another thing. That really tells you a lot about a person's chart, in addition to just being the way of finding out the condition of a given planet. All right, next we can ask what house the planet is placed in. Of course, partially we're doing this to look at where in the life that planet will tend to what part of the life that planet rules, in addition to the planet's natural significations, as we talked about in our last class. But we're also looking at whether this is an angular, a cadent, or a succedent house. Right, planets in angular houses have their volume really turned up, whereas planets in cadent houses are much less prominent generally. So we can look at the houses, in terms of the angular, cadent, and succedent, for the dynamics of the planet, how dynamic, how loud, how powerful that planet is in a given chart. Which this is one thing that you'll have to kind of grapple with as you study astrology and look at charts, is the distinction between how strong a planet is and how favorable a planet is. Right, those aren't exactly the same thing, or they're not the same thing. Sometimes they're related, but there can be a distinction between a planet being favorable and a planet being strong. All right, and then also, is the planet close to one of the angles? As we saw, that a planet that's very close to the ascendant, midheaven, the descendant, or the IC, that also makes the planet, strong, bigger and louder and more prominent. All right, and then we also want to look at aspects, especially close aspects. Or strong, applying aspects or superior aspects. We always want to prioritize for the most important things. So what aspects is the planet making? What relationships does that planet have to other planets in the chart, and how do those relationships influence that planet? How does that connect their different significations together, or how does it either help or hinder the planet in question? Also, are there any other planets in the same sign? Just being in the same sign as another planet will tend to, those planets will tend to influence each other. All right, and then finally, some of the stuff that we were just talking about with synodic cycles, we can ask, is the planet within 15 degrees of the sun? And then if so, is it under the beams? Is it combust? Is it Kazimi? And always making sure to check, if it is combust, always making sure to check whether or not the planet is in its own sign or in its exaltation as a mitigation for that condition. We can also ask, is the planet retrograde or is the planet direct? Again, it's just one piece of the total picture here. And then for the moon in general, you can always just look at what phase the moon is in. Is she waxing or waning? Is she getting close to full? Is she close to new? Is she at about half? That's always a nice thing to consider in any chart. All right, and now just summarizing, again, this is in no way complete, and there's lots of different takes on this. Other people would make this list in a different way, I'm sure, but this is just my suggestion for some basic considerations for reading a natal chart. Just, and again, there's more techniques, all kinds of techniques that we haven't talked about, and there's lots more details that we could add, but just a very basic approach to reading a natal chart. So I suggest starting with the ascendant. So look at what's the rising sign. What sign is the first house? What sign is the ascendant in? Also looking at the ruler of and again, because remember the first house and the ascendant signifies like the person in question. So what sign that is obviously going to be a really important part of that story. But in addition to just the sign, in addition to just saying, oh, I have Capricorn rising, so I'm like a Capricorn. The significations of Capricorn, are an important factor in describing what I'm like. We also want to say that my ascendant, I don't have Capricorn rising, but just as an example, the ascendant would be ruled by Saturn. And so we want to look at where Saturn is in the chart, Saturn as that ascendant ruler. What sign is Saturn in, what house is Saturn in, and what condition is Saturn in? Is Saturn, in a place that it's strong? Is it in a favorable house? Does it have aspects that are helpful? Right, you want to look at the ruler of the ascendant for working this out. Right, like if Saturn has is conjunct with another planet, we saw that in Jack Parsons' chart where he had Gemini rising, right? So Mercury was his ascendant ruler, but Mercury was in Scorpio and very closely conjunct Mars, right? So Mercury really picks up a lot of that martial nature, and so that Mars nature really reflects, like in Parsons' own personality and in his life, because of that really strong connection of Mars to the ruler of his ascendant. All right, and then finally, you'd also want to look at any other planets that are in the first house. Any other planets in the first house will tend to influence, the person themselves, because that's what the first house signifies. All right, then next, you'll want to look at the two luminaries. And so you're going to prioritize by the sect light. So by day, you'll look at the sun will be more important, and the person will be more characterized by the sun, whereas at night, the person will be more characterized by the moon. So you look at the sect light, and just for a basic thing, look at sign. What sign is the light in? Is that if the sun's in Leo, that's of course an important thing. The sun is in its own sign. That's an important thing to take into account, as well as also just being colored by that sign. If you're born during the day, and the sun is in a sign ruled by Venus, there'll certainly be a Venusian influence in what you are like, and the light of your mind and the light of your intelligence will be colored by the planet that rules the sect light. And also the house topics as well. Same thing with the ruler of the ascendant. What house they're found in will tend to really like emphasize the topics of that house in the person's life. And that can also be like dependent or sometimes independent of the person's own like purposes and goals, especially if like the ascendant ruler was placed in like a more difficult part of the chart. You wouldn't say that the person that's what they like are sort of oriented to by their like what they want or something like that. But it may just be that they frequently find themselves dealing with the topics of that house, right? And again, there's always like multiple factors here. We're not just looking at one planet for this. All right, and then also, just condition in general, as well as close aspects again, and for the moon, we want to look at her phase. And then after you've looked at the sect light, then you also want to look at the other luminary as well. So if it's again, if it's a day chart, you look at the sun first, but you'd still consider the moon. And if it's a night chart, you look at the moon first, but you'd still consider the sun as well. And we can also think about some of the just the core significations of the sun and moon as well, about body and soul, or the mind, as well as the vehicle for the mind. All of those ideas as well. Really critical core factors in any chart. All right, and then number 4 here, I'm just suggesting that, again, just a quick way of getting a good basic sense of a person in a natal chart is to look at the benefic of the sect in favor. Because this will tend to be, I mean, again, there's other factors that can influence this, but it will tend to be the most positive planet in the chart, and so that'll tend to be pretty noticeable in the person's life. So in a day chart, you'd want to look at Jupiter, and in a night chart, you'd want to look at Venus. And so just look at like what house is that planet in, and as well as what houses does that planet rule. Again, there's other factors to consider, but all things being equal, whatever house that planet is found in and whatever houses that planet rules, those topics will tend to go well for a person. They'll tend to be fortunate in those areas. Things will be fairly easy and fairly problem-free. Things, yeah, they'll be strong and they'll tend to go well, right? It'll be very favorable for that person. Right, so if you had like Jupiter in a day chart in the 10th house, you'd think, oh, this person would probably be pretty successful, in their career or whatever their work in the world would be. All right, and then also looking at how that planet, and again, we saw this in Jack Parsons' chart, the way that Venus really improves the condition, because he's born at night. We looked at Venus and how that improves the condition of a lot of the other planets. So look at Jupiter in a day chart and Venus in a night chart, and look at close aspects, especially like superior aspects coming from that planet to other planets, because that will really improve the condition of other planets. That would be the planet most empowered to help out and assist the other planets. So that's always an important thing to look at. And then after we've looked at the, generally the most beneficial planet in the chart, we also want to look at the most challenging or the most difficult planet in the chart. And this will be the malefic that's contrary to the sect. So Mars is a night planet, so Mars is most difficult by day. So in a day chart, you'd want to look at Mars as like the most difficult thing in the chart, all things being equal. And so again, just looking at the same things, looking at what house Mars is found in, what house Mars rules, as well as aspects that Mars is making to the other planets. And then by night, you just do the same thing with Saturn. Yeah, so again, this is just a basic summary, and there's so much more that could be added, but this is a lot of the really core stuff. I think if you got pretty good and some facility with just doing this, there's really you're not going to get every single detail out of a natal chart, but you could really get a lot. You could make a lot of, I think, very accurate and powerful statements, about personality and temperament, and about the way different areas of a person's life will tend to go. There's really so much that you could do with just this and with just the information that we've covered in this series. Yeah, let's just keep moving on here. All right, so I just want to add one additional use of the greater ritual of the hexagram. So shifting gears here, that was the last of the astrology for now. So shifting gears to magic and back to the hexagram rituals. So one additional use of the greater ritual of the hexagram is to invoke the Sephiroth, or the powers of the Sephiroth. And so this is, the logic here is going to be a little bit similar to the way that we took the planetary, the greater ritual of the hexagram to invoke the 7 planets, and then adapted that to invoking zodiacal powers. We're also going to adapt that to invoking Sephirothic powers. So in order to do this, in order to decide which of the 7 planets governs each of the 10 Sephiroth, we're going to use what we call the palace model of the Sephiroth here, with the 10 Sephiroth grouped into the 7 palaces. So the 3 supernals, right? This is Kether, Hokmah. I hope you can all see my cursor here. This is Kether, Hokmah, and Bina. The 3 supernals are all in the same palace here at the top. Then Hesed, Gevurah, Tefereth, Netzach, and Hod. Each one of those Sephiroth just has a palace, or is a palace, unto itself. And then finally, the 7th and last palace contains the lower 2 Sephiroth of Yesod and Malkuth. And so now what we're going to do is just lay the hexagram on top of this image, and then that planet will use the hexagram of that planet to invoke that Sephirothic power. So again, thinking kind of along the same lines as the way that we adapted the planetary hexagrams to work with zodiacal powers, we're kind of thinking along the same lines here. So for Hesed, through Hod, this is really straightforward, right? Hesed, you're going to just use like the Jupiter hexagram. For Gevra, you'll use the Mars hexagram. For Tefereth, you'll use the solar hexagram, and you can use the unicursal, of course. For Netzach, you'll use the Venus's hexagram, and then to invoke Hod, you'll use the hexagram of Mercury. Now, to invoke any one of the three supernals, you'll use the form of the hexagram of Saturn, and then to invoke either Malkuth or Yesod, you'll use the hexagram associated with the moon. So that's, you'll draw it in the way, right? You'll start, if you're invoking Bina, Hukma, or Kether, right? You'd be starting at the top point here, and then going clockwise, and then going to the opposite point and going clockwise again. And then to banish, you'd be starting at that same point and then going counterclockwise, right? So it follows all those same rules. So we're just using this as a way of just showing which hexagram to use for which sephira. All right, so, and now similar to the way that we adapted the planetary hexagrams into the zodiacal hexagrams, instead of using the planetary or the zodiacal colors and hierarchies, we'll use the sephirothic colors and hierarchies. So use the sephirothic hierarchy of the Sephiroth in question, and this will obviously distinguish between like whether you're, if you're using Yesod or Malkuth, although you'll be drawing your hexagram in the same way, you'll be visualizing it in different colors, and you'll be invoking a different hierarchy. If you don't know the Sephirothic hierarchies and colors, you can check out the series that I did on the Sephiroth. Those are all up on YouTube. All that information is there. And of course, you can look it up in 777 as well. And then again, same logic with the colors. You'll want to do a background of the, I suggest using the queen scale colors. Those are the ones that are kind of the default for the Sephiroth. So use a background of the queen scale color of the Sephiroth, and then trace the hexagram in the complementary color. Now, I've never seen in any of like the Golden Dawn material any like specific statements. If anybody else can think of one, let me know. But I've never seen any specific statements about what glyph to trace in the center of the hexagrams. And so what I think makes a lot of sense and seems to work, and that you might want to use is just to trace the Hebrew name of the Sephiroth in the center of the hexagram. So just with your wand or your finger or whatever, just spell out the name of the Sephiroth like in the center of your hexagram, right? Instead of using like the planetary glyph. I think that makes sense. Yeah, it seems to work. Yeah, so there you go. This is something you can experiment with, is using that hexagram rituals to invoke the powers of the Sephiroth. And interestingly, I think we saw the way that the hierarchies of the planets were derived from their being lined up, with the Sephiroth. We now have some of that in kind of an opposite way, that same alignment of the Sephiroth to the planets also shows the ways that we can adapt the hexagram to invoking the Sephirothic powers. All right. So I also just wanted to show you Crowley in the Book of Lies does a few really interesting things with both the symbolism of the hexagram, and he presents the Star Sapphire, his version of the ritual of the hexagram. So we're not going to cover this in a kind of complete way, but I just wanted to introduce some of this as a kind of alternate version of some of this symbolism, and also just as a demonstration of the way that like traditional rituals can be adapted for various purposes, and the way that it also builds up and adds some really nice layers to the symbolism of the hexagram that we've been talking about all throughout this series. All right, so on the left there, this is chapter 69 of the Book of Lies. Yes, we see 69. That just says chapter 69 in Greek there. And this chapter is called The Way to Succeed and the Way to Suck Eggs. So as I'm sure you're probably all already aware, the image or the metaphor or whatever you want to call it being used here, obviously related to the number 69, is of mutual oral sex, right? Right, and so again, whether we take this as directly being like about like a sexual practice, or whether it's just using like sexual symbolism, is I think it doesn't necessarily have to be just one way or the other. right, we don't want to reduce things simply to being like just symbols, or reducing symbolic or magical principles to being simply like sort of encoded ways of talking about sex. All right, so right. So let's just read through the chapter here, right? So Crow says, "This is the Holy Hexagram. Plunge from the height, O God, and interlock with man. Plunge from the height, O man, and interlock with beast." Right, so we see some of this symbolism that we've already seen with the hexagram of the unity of opposites here, right? And so now we're talking about God and man being united. And again, we have this in terms of a descent rather than an ascent, which is maybe the way we normally would think of that. And again, there's a very intentional like reversal going on here. And then plunge from the height of man and interlock with beasts, right? So these like kind of two different unions happening here. All right. And then the red triangle is the descending tongue of grace. The blue triangle is the ascending tongue of prayer. So, I mean, obviously, the reference to tongue here, of course, is another, sexual reference. But what's interesting is that the triangles here have been reversed. So we now have the red triangle pointing downwards and the blue triangle pointing upwards, right? As if the hexagram had been rotated and is upside down, which is a really interesting thing to contemplate about what that means and what the significations of it are. A downward pointing red triangle also in like the Thelemic tradition really symbolizes, Rahor Kuit and Horus. So we get part of that symbolism coming with the downward pointing red triangle that's now interlocking with an upward pointing blue triangle. And Crow's talking about the red triangle as a descending tongue of grace, and the blue triangle as an ascending tongue of prayer. So like grace and prayer as kind of opposite interlocking forces here. All right, and then he says, this interchange, the double gift of tongues, the word of double power, abrahadabra, is the sign of the great work, for the great work is accomplished in silence. And behold, is not that word equal to Heth, that is Cancer, whose sigil is, right, we have the sigil of Cancer. All right, so again, this idea of the double gift of tongues, which is pretty obvious there, what's happening there. And now he's equating this idea of like the double gift of tongues with what he's calling the word of double power, abrahadabra. There's also the concept of the wand of double power, which, at least for Crowley, he also talks about as symbolizing, the powers of the active and the passive. And abrahadabra, rather than being so active and passive, tends to symbolize the union of microcosm and macrocosm, right? Which is one thing that the hexagram symbolizes is that union. So now we have the word of double power, the word that unites the microcosm and macrocosm. At least that's one way of interpreting it. Of course, there's so many other layers that we could get into here, but it's one way of looking at it. Right, and so that for Crowley is the great work, the union of the microcosm and the macrocosm. And of course, the great work being accomplished in silence here. This is another kind of humorous references to the sexual imagery here, right? It's in silence because your mouth is otherwise occupied. Right, and so he says, and behold, is not that word equal to Heth, right? Abrahadabra by gematria sums to 418, and Heth, the letter name spelled in full, also sums to 418. Right, and so that is Cancer, whose sigil is, right, and so the sigil of Cancer looks very much like the number 69 here. So he's done some really like some complex but really interesting juggling of the symbols here and visual resemblance, which is all really core stuff in the the logic of gematria and the symbolism. All right, and then. Finishing up here, he says, this work also eats up itself, accomplishes its own end, nourishes the worker, leaves no seed, is perfect in itself. And so, again, obviously the sexual aspect of that, I'm sure, is very obvious. But this idea of the work eating up itself, right, really reminds me of the symbol of the Ouroboros, or especially the depiction of like a double dragon or a double serpent, who are each swallowing the other's tail, as a symbol of the of eternity and of cycles again, and that eternal cycle that has no beginning or end, right? Just like a circle has no beginning or end. I don't know. I think that's a very yeah, I think that there's a lot to think about there and to meditate on. And again, I just have one example here, image of a double Ouroboros there. Yeah, a lot to meditate on there. And then finally, Crowley kind of ironically quotes John the Evangelist, "Little children, love one another." All right. So that's some of the symbolism that Crowley's working here with the hexagram, within the context of this particular book. And I think it's just an interesting example of the way that once you have like the basic significations of something worked out, you can then vary that and elaborate on that for various purposes, right? Like you can take the standard way of arranging the hexagram and its symbolism and rotate it upside down, and then look at the way like this stuff can be inverted, right? It's just a way of producing like additional meanings and additional like layers of symbolism here. All right, so just let's see, we're running a little short on time here, so I don't want to take too much time here with the Star Sapphire. I guess that astrology stuff took a little longer than I thought it was going to, but yeah, we'll just sort of walk through this fairly briefly here. So this ritual, I think, definitely this ritual has been interpreted in a number of different ways. Some people see it as actually just a variation on a hexagram ritual. The performance of it basically looks pretty similar to doing a lesser or greater ritual of the hexagram. There's just different words and things are being done in slightly different signs. Things are being done in slightly different ways. Others take it as an entirely like an encoding of a sex magic practice. Others think it's I've heard people interpret this as more like the divulging of certain secrets and certain principles, like in the form of a ritual. So I think that, again, it doesn't have to just be one or the other. I think there's a number of all valid interpretations, and it's valuable to read it in different ways and to work with it in different ways. But just on the surface, the easiest way of interpreting it is just as a variation, a hexagram ritual variation, similar to the way that the star ruby is a variation on like the lesser ritual of the pentagram. All right, so let the adept be armed with his magic rood, right? That's another name for wand, and of course you can read the symbolism there as well, and provided with his mystic rose. Which again, you can unpack the symbols there depending on how you want to interpret this. All right, and in the center, let him give the LVX signs, right? The signs that like in the the analysis, the keyword, you're giving the LVX signs, right? So there's some of that logic being carried over from the standard hexagram rituals to this new version here. Or if he can keep silent about them, the signs of NOX. Now we're not going to worry about the signs of NOX here, so we'll just sort of, you can fill that in for yourself. But these are the set of signs, where the LVX signs, LVX spells the word looks for light, NOX spells nox, which means night, and they refer to the process of the transition from like the adept grades to crossing the abyss in the AA system. But we'll just not worry about that here. All right, so let him advance to the east and make the Holy Hexagram, right? And so if you're interpreting this as just a variation of hexagram ritual, you just draw a hexagram in the east, draw like a standard invoking hexagram in the east, and then say Pater et Mater Unis Deus, and then vibrate Ararita, right? So Pater et Mater Unis Deus, Father and Mother are one God. Let him go around to the south, make the Holy Hexagram. And again, of course, make the Holy Hexagram, you could add other interpretations of that as well, but just on a surface, meaning it's just you're just drawing and invoking hexagram. Right, and then say Mater et Filius Unis Deus, Mother and Son are one God. Let him go around to the west, make the Holy Hexagram, and say Filius et Filia Unis Deus Ararita. Son and daughter are one God, right? And so we have the four persons of the tetragrammaton, right? The father, mother, son, and daughter here, and we're taking them in pairs and declaring them to be the same or to be united, right? Which is another way of talking about sexual symbolism as like the symbolism of unification and the coming together and the becoming one of separate things. Right, and then finally in the north, make the Holy Hexagram and say Filia et Pater Unis Deus. So this is daughter and father, one God. And of course, Ararita, that magical formula of the unity within diversity. All right, then let him return to the center, right? So like to the center of your ritual space, and so to the center of all, making the rosy cross as he may know how, right? So the rose cross here as the union of the cross and the rose, or the union of the rood, the wand and the rose, or the wand and the cup, all that symbolism is happening here. And you can interpret that, in different ways, of course, saying Ararita, Ararita, Ararita. And in this, the signs shall be those of Set triumphant. That's like the V sign from LVX, and of Baphomet, which actually I was going to talk about the NOx signs. We're running out of time here, but this sign here that you see, this is the sign of Baphomet here, also called the sign of Moulier. All right, and now again, this next part you can interpret in a variety of different ways. Also shall Set appear in the circle. Let him drink of the sacrament and let him communicate the same. Then let him, the magician, say, omnia in duos, duo in unum, unis in nihil, haec nec quatuor, nec omnia, nec duo, nec unis, nec nihil sunt. So this means all in two, two in one in none. These are neither four, nor all, nor two, nor one, nor nothing. Right, so interesting set of magical formulas here to contemplate, the idea of all in two, two in one, and then one in nothing. We have a variety of, multiplicity and unity, and then the zero of non-duality beyond even the one. And then we have Gloria Patri, et Matri, et Filio, et Filii, et Spiritui Sancto externo, et Spiritui Sancto interno, ut erat est erit, in saecula saeculorum, sex in uno, per nomen septem in uno, ararita. So this is based on the Christian Gloria here, but adapted for like Kabbalistic and magical and Thelemic symbolism here. So we have glory to the Father and to the Mother and to the Son and to the Daughter and to the Holy Spirit without and the Holy Spirit within, as it was, is, and shall be. In saecula saeculorum is something like unto the ages of ages. 6 in 1, sex in uno, 6 in 1, right? Just like we have these 6, Father, Mother, Son, Daughter, and the Holy Spirit without and within, as well as we can think of course, the 6 points of the hexagram. 6 in 1, per nomen septem in uno, by the name 7 in 1, right? Ararita is the name 7 in 1. It's 7 letters, 7 words, signifying the divine unity, Ararita. And then finally, let him then repeat the signs of LVX, but not those of NOx, for it is not he that shall arise in the sign of Isis rejoicing. So yeah, I just wanted to introduce that and to sort of get you thinking about the way that this is like an adaptation of the hexagram rituals. And the way it also really adds and develops the basic symbolism, like the Golden Dawn's symbolism of the hexagram and some other traditional meanings of it, and adds this whole other like Thelemic dimension, as well as of course like sexual symbolism and sex magic practices. The way that this all gets kind of built up on a foundation of the core rituals and core practices. All right, I thought we would get here to this point a little bit faster. So let's see. So just real briefly, I wanted to add a little bit about, this is Liber Ararita, one of the Thelemic holy books. Let's see, I was going to read through and discuss like the first chapter of it, but I'll just sort of leave that for you. You can easily find it online. But yeah, look up the Liber Ararita, and there's a lot of the Sephirothic symbolism in there. There's a bunch of planetary symbolism that should all be pretty obvious after you've been through this course. And it also really develops this idea of Ararita and the idea of like seeking the one and seeking the unity behind diversity. So there's a lot of really good stuff, and it really adds extra layers in depth to a lot of what we've been talking about here, and helps to sort of connect like practical ritual procedure to to deeper like mystical and Kabbalistic and all that sort of layers. All right, but yeah, so just to wrap up here in our last couple of minutes. I just wanted to sort of set this topic of the planets and the planetary cycles and the planetary and zodiacal magic that we've been talking about. Just sort of set it, of course, because this is talking about our our solar system and our what the heavens look like to us, from the planet Earth, but setting this into a broader and more universal sort of framework. So on the left here, this is a diagram that some of you have seen before, that I've used in a few classes here. This is from Thomas Digges, who was one of the early English language, first actually an English language proponent of the Copernican or heliocentric universe. And so obviously he's got the sun in the center, surrounded by there's the Earth and the elemental world, surrounded by the moon, and then Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And now what he have also realized is that in the heliocentric universe, the idea of the fixed stars being on a single sphere doesn't hold up, and they realize that actually these stars are also suns, just like our suns, lying at all different distances from the Earth. And it was commonly thought for a while that there's actually an infinite number of them. I mean, that's not what we think today, but there's certainly an unimaginably large number of them. And so in this outer circle here, representing this infinity of stars spreading out in all directions, Digges has written, "This orb of stars, fixed infinitely up, extendeth itself in altitude spherically, and therefore immovable, the palace of felicity, garnished with perpetual shining glorious lights innumerable, far exceeding our sun both in quantity and quality, the very court of celestial angels, devoid of grief and replenished with perfect endless joy, the habitacle for the elect." So yeah, just this really, I think, kind of striking way of expressing that, a new theological and symbolic meaning of the fact that we're no longer looking at the stars as just a fixed sphere, but as an infinite number of stars in infinite space. And so a contemporary of Thomas Digges is Giordano Bruno, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and if you're not, you should definitely look up who Bruno is, a very important figure, as well as an interesting and unfortunately tragic life. Bruno was burned at the stake as a heretic in 1600. But and again, Bruno was a contemporary of Digges and was thinking along many of these same lines, and really helped to formulate some of the deeper philosophical and kind of hermetic and cosmological implications of this understanding of the universe as being, rather than us being the center, as the universe being full of an unlimited number of other suns, each with their own planets. So Bruno, in his work Cause, Principle, and Unity, says, "This universe is therefore one, infinite and immobile. I say that the absolute possibility is one, that the act is one, the form or soul is one, the matter or body is one, the thing is one, being is one." And then a little bit later, a couple paragraphs later, expanding on that, this sort of oneness and the idea of infinity here. He says, "You come no nearer to commensurability, likeness, union, and identity with the infinite by being a man than by being an ant, or by being a star than by being a man. For you get no nearer to that infinite by being the sun or the moon than by being a man or an ant. This is because in the infinite, there is no difference between those things. And what I say of them applies just as well to all other existent particular things." So Bruno's really working through some of these ideas of what it would mean to be to be situated within the infinite, since everything is the infinite is infinitely larger than, no matter how big something is, the infinite is still infinitely larger than it. And there's also some language here that I think is very reminiscent of things we've already been talking about, as well as a lot of the language in the Thelemic holy books. And so here is our last slide here, just some language concerning stars and infinity, and also the unity within the infinite. All right, so this is another quote from Liber Ararita, from the last chapter of Liber Ararita. At the touch of the fire Kadosh, Kadosh here, Kadosh means holy and also takes on a lot of esoteric significances. So we're not talking about standard elemental fire, but about something much higher. At the touch of the fire Kadosh, the mind of the Father was broken up into the brilliance of our Lord the Son. At the touch of the fire Kadosh, the brilliance of our Lord the Sun was absorbed in the knot of Our Lady of the body of the milk of the stars. right? So this Our Lady of the Stars here, right? This is the star goddess Nuit, the goddess of infinite space and infinite stars. All right, and then from Libra 65, we read, my head is jeweled with 12 stars. My body is white as milk of the stars. It is bright with the blue of the abyss of stars invisible. All right, and then, of course, this is the stellar revealing here, and this is Nuit, arched over the entire stele. And just 3 quotes concerning these things we've been talking about here from the Book of the Law. Now, therefore, I am known to ye by my name Nuit, and to him by a secret name which I will give him when at last he knoweth me. Since I am infinite space and the infinite stars thereof, do ye also thus. Bind nothing. Let there be no difference made among you between any one thing and any other thing, for thereby there cometh hurt. So I don't want to comment too much on the meaning of that passage, but there's some interesting similarities in language with some of what we were just looking at on the previous slide there that I think is very interesting. And I think it's also very significant. That the way the time period in which the Book of the Law is received, and we're going to talk about the Golden Dawn beginning, or Eliphas Levi and the Golden Dawn, and then I think especially Crowley really helping to bring the Western esoteric tradition from its pre-modern expression into its modern expression. And one of the such significant parts of that transition is the move from this Aristotelian geocentric and very small universe to a new, not just heliocentric universe, but a universe of an infinite of unlimited, or at least an incredibly vast number of suns and other galaxies and other star systems, right? And so really profound shift in the conception of what the cosmos is and what our place is in it. And I think Crowley's work and Thiem in general is a really powerful new expression of the Western esoteric tradition, in the context of this modern expanded universe. All right, and then just 2 more quotes from the Book of the Law here. Come forth, O children, under the stars, and take your fill of love. And finally, every man and every woman is a star. So I think just talking about the stars and the cosmos, just helps to kind of broaden out from the specifics of astrology and astrological magic practices to something really vast and profound on cosmic and theological and philosophical levels and everything, and in the understanding of ourselves as stars, moving through the cosmos. Each one of us just one star, in an infinite body of stars, but nonetheless, equal to and no less significant than any other star, within that system. All right, so that wraps it up here. So just some suggestions for continuing practices beyond this. Beyond this series, you continue your practice with hexagram rituals. Obviously there's a lot of things you can do now with hexagram rituals. In addition to the lesser ritual, the hexagram, you've also got the 7 planetary hexagram rituals, as well as the lunar nodes and some other variations that we introduced that you can practice with. You've got the 12 signs of the zodiac that you can use the hexagrams to work with, as well as the 10 Sephiroth now as well. So there's really a lot to experiment with here, and a lot to get practice with. So a lot to keep working on with that. Again, for members of the Temple of the Silver Star, whether academic or initiatory track, we don't suggest hexagram rituals as a part of your, regular practice until such time as that's actually formally assigned to you. But it's perfectly fine to experiment with this and get some practice in, as an experimental thing. That's totally fine. Right, and then next to suggestions for astrological study, just start looking at again the birth charts of friends, of yourself, of course. But look at friends, family, like authors or artists or movie stars, whatever that you like. Those are all really great charts to look into. It's never too early to start looking at charts, and the process of actually reading charts is a huge part of just understanding the basic symbols and basic concepts. Sort of gets you up and moving, but you have to actually read charts and look at the way that the different significations of the planets and the houses and everything else actually manifests in actual people's lives. So it's never too early to start doing that, and that really becomes the core of getting good at this, is just reading lots of charts. And reading them in detail and in nuanced ways and all that. All right, and then finally, also just observing planetary movements like the lunar phase, on an ongoing basis, just sort of keeping track of where the planets are now, aspects they're making to each other, what phase of the moon, what phase the moon is in, all that stuff is really good to keep track, and notice how that syncs up with things in your life, in the lives of people around you, in the world in general. You can look at the news along with astrological transits and things like that. That's all really interesting stuff to do. So you can track this using an ephemeris or a piece of software or other like online applications. And you can start to pay attention to cycles too. Start paying attention to the different synodic cycles of the planet and think about these as like the planet's journey, in relationship to the sun. And again, if you're a little more advanced here, you can also start to track different transits to your natal planets, or to incorporate transits into other timing systems. And then finally, I think it's also just really valuable to actually observe these things in the sky. So much of traditional astrology is really based on observational principles, like we saw with the solar conjunctions there. A lot of that meaning is based on what actually happens when a planet is close to the sun in the sky. So just observing the planets, paying attention to but looking at the moon, when she's visible, and observing stars and constellations. I think that's a really helpful or maybe even really essential part of understanding this stuff, is to actually look at it in the sky. And I think that also gives a lot of instead of a chart just being this abstract symbolic thing, you can really start to ground it and root it in what the sky actually looks like in a particular place at a particular moment. And then just observe the effects of the planets in your own life and in the world at large, and just paying attention to this stuff on a regular basis will be a huge part of getting good at it. All right, yeah. So if anybody has any questions about anything we've done today or anything basically from the whole series, I'm more than happy to do that now. So for more information about our work, you can visit tots.org/FAQ. As I'm sure anyone listening to this is already aware. There's my email address if you'd like to get in contact with me. And as always, we do have a $5 suggested donation for anyone who's not a member of the academic or the initiatory track. Let's see, I've got a comment here from Dio Confide. Let's see, I got the message that were posted to YouTube, but I never could find the links. The links provided the message. Yeah, sure. I can actually, I can do that right now. Let me just stop the recording. And anyone watching this on YouTube already has the YouTube links, of course. So yeah, let me just end the recording, and then I'll get you the link right now. So yeah, if there's no other questions, we'll just wrap up here. For anyone listening on YouTube, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe for more updates. And I will be doing another class series starting in June. So yeah, about a month from now, I'm not sure exactly which days it'll be, but about a month from now, starting a new class series on literal Qabalah, on the Qabalah of manipulating letters and numbers, and we might do some Greek Qabalah as well. Well, of course, we'll focus on Hebrew Qabalah primarily, on some Pythagorean stuff. But yeah, look for that, and look for announcements, on our email list or on Facebook for more on that. All right, 93s, everybody. Take care.